So this is the third of our series on the influential religious personalities or religious folks, believers, or just folks that have been living out their faith, who have definitely made an impact in community or society and the world. And so today we'll be looking at the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and he's actually the guy right there. But let's begin with a word of prayer. Most gracious and loving God, we give you thanks as we come together this day and continue in our study and looking at these religious individuals who have definitely made an impact in the world and in the lives around them. Lord, we pray for your Spirit to be with us and guide us as always, as we gleam upon these individuals, these lives, that it may be motivation for us in however way that you call us to live out our faith. We pray for your blessing upon us as we come together, and as always, may your Spirit be our guide. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, so Desmond Tutu. Desmond Tutu, yes. You know what? I was hoping. One of the things I wanted to do was actually create a collage of all of his expressions. Desmond Tutu is, how many of you know Desmond Tutu or have heard of him, right? Many of, several of us, because he's fairly recent. He just passed away less than 2 years ago, December 26th of 2021. So, yeah, it was less than 2 years ago. But he's one that is very dramatic, and there's a reason for that. But then he has wonderful facial expressions, especially when he's preaching, talking. He laughs a lot, and he has a contagious laughter, which again, I was hoping. I don't have a video of him laughing. I have another video of him talking, but he has this contagious laughter, and he's one that is extremely pastoral and yet extremely prophetic, and that's, if I were to describe one thing, a way to explain who he is, he is definitely a modern day prophet. Desmond Tutu, of course, as many of you know, is Archbishop in the Anglican Church in South Africa, and he's known primarily for his anti-apartheid movements, human rights activism. So, kind of describing, explaining his early life, Desmond Tutu, he actually has Methodist roots, and primarily it's because his father, Zechariah, and unfortunately there's no pictures of him when he's young. And the reason for that is, of course, he grew up in South Africa in extremely poor conditions. His father, Zechariah, was a teacher, and he worked at the Methodist mission. In fact, so he was a teacher, and then he later becomes headmaster, principal of various schools. And just like the Methodist system, he got moved around too. And even though he wasn't a minister, but he was, a teacher, a missionary pretty much, that got moved around. The living conditions were not always that great. So then, Desmond Tutu was born on October 7th, 1931. So again, it's in the 30s, in a small town of South Africa. Very poor family. One of the things he said. Because one of the homes that the homes that were provided for even the headmaster wasn't like homes here, right? It's not even one of these modular units. Okay, they're not even made out of wood. They're made of mud. They're mud shacks. And so he said, although we weren't affluent, we were not destitute either. That's his perspective, okay? It's not like one or the other. It's like he realized, look, he's not, and because he grew up in a time when you could definitely see there were some people in that area. There were some people that clearly were wealthy, and of course he was not one of them. In order to support families while they were, why do I have a duplicate slide? Illnesses. I'll get to that. In fact, one of the things that while the father was a headmaster at the schools, the mother also had to work, and the mother then wasn't a teacher. She was more of a not a servant, but one who worked in people's homes, cook, what did they call him? A domestic worker. So she worked in people's homes, cleaning, cooking, that stuff. And Desmond Tutu, when he was young, would go with his mother, and a lot of times accompany his mom and collect laundry from the people that. And she wouldn't just work in one house. She would work at a community, cleaning a neighborhood of homes and collect the laundry. So he would do the laundry as a 10-year-old, for these homes. So that's the upbringing that he had. As a child, he was susceptible to a lot of illness. He wasn't a healthy kid. He was very frail. He survived polio, which left him with a very weakened hand, one that was He permanently damaged his right hand. Because his father worked in the Methodist mission, he was baptized as a Methodist. But later on, because of his, he grew up with 3 older sisters, and one of the sisters wanted to go to a more of an African, for the black church. So they ended up joining the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is still Methodist. It grew out of the Methodist Church. And then later on, they ended up joining the Anglican Church. He survived polio. He also was burned as a child. One of the things what he says is that he had a loving relationship with his dad. He admired his dad, a close relationship. Yet at the same time, the father would have bouts of anger and frustration because of the poverty, and sometimes would get very violent at home. And so at those times, and then there was some drinking involved, and so he talks about some of the pains of growing up in that type of environment. So he was baptized in the Methodist Church, because his father was a headmaster in a school. Desmond Tutu was exposed to education, which wasn't always common in that community. And he learned that he loved to read. He loved reading comics and fairy tales, and he just was always drawn to it. He attended a Swedish boarding school afterwards, which was then led by the Anglican Church. And so what we kind of see in Desmond Tutu's life is that he becomes very much linked with various denominations in a very good way. And again, growing up in a very modest home, a lot of this had to do with whichever church entity that provided support, survival, right? And so the Anglican Church had a boarding school, which he then started going to, and so forth. And then he went to the Bantu high school afterwards. During his high school years, he got tuberculosis, and because of tuberculosis, he was hospitalized for 18 months. During those 18 months, he was visited frequently by a priest, an Anglican priest by the name of Trevor Huddleston. Priest Huddleston would later become a bishop and later become an archbishop. And he becomes an important figure in Desmond Tutu's life. In fact, Desmond Tutu said that he is the single most influential person in his life. Where, after 18 months in the hospital, he got better. And again, part of that getting better was the encouragement that he received from the priest that visited him. Huddleston, by the way, was extremely instrumental, well, not instrumental, but very close to another person that I'll talk about in a bit, Nelson Mandela, right? Which their paths will cross many ways. After being in the hospital for 18 months, he gets better. He returns back to school. He finishes school, and he had this dream of studying medicine. Usually, folks that have certain illnesses in the family or themselves, does so. And so he studied hard, and he got into what was the name of that medical school? One of the top medical schools in Johannesburg. Unfortunately, the family can't afford it. So he couldn't afford it. And so because the University of Witwatersrand or something, the family couldn't afford the tuition. And so he ended up going to University of Pretoria under a government scholarship to become a teacher. So he became a teacher just like his dad. Which, God works in mysterious ways, because as he is at the University of Pretoria, getting his teacher's education, he gets involved, very active, student council, literary and drama society, okay, which kind of explains how if you've ever heard Desmond Tutu preach, well, yeah, he's like all over, and he's not angry, but he's extremely passionate, and it's very dramatic. Anyhow, during that time, he was also part of the debate society, and it was during one of the debate events that he met a young lawyer by the name of Nelson Mandela. Now, Nelson Mandela is about when was Nelson Mandela born? Like 1918, 14? Yeah, so Nelson Mandela is about 15 years older than him. So, again, but also during that time, he also then meets his wife. She goes by Leah. I know she has a name. I can't pronounce that name. No, Nomalizo Leah Shinzani? Shinzani? Yeah. So, but she goes by Leah. And they both become teachers. She's the primary teacher, and he becomes a high school teacher, and starts teaching and so forth. In 1953, so by the time they graduate, it's like around 1950. Desmond Tutu and his wife become teachers. During this time, so it's around the 1950-ish time, right? 1940s, 1950s. So what is the context of South Africa during this time? Apartheid, right? So apartheid, it started, well, sometime in the 1800s, 19th century, but definitely during the turn of the 20th century, it started to really become an issue. The British colonial government began segregating racial groups. And a lot of that had to do with back in early in the 20th century, 1901, 1907 or something, there was various bubonic plague, outbreaks of the bubonic plague. And they used that as a pretense for grouping racial groups, to say that by keeping racial groups together, they can contain an outbreak. Well, the way they segregated them, of course, was that the white folks were at the center of the city, and the non-white folks were on the outskirts of the city, right? And then they created these, what they called townships, for the non-white folks. Well, in 1913, they passed a law called the Natives Land Act, which reserved 90% of the land in South Africa for the white population. You know, and all of this was under the pretense of, well, because we got to keep the separation, and since they're already in the center, well, why don't the center or the city part become the white folks? And so 90% of that, so the law stated that you had to be of a certain ethnicity in order to own land in the center, and those that were not part of that ethnic group could only own land on the other. There's a law being passed in Texas and Florida right now that's sort of on. Does this sound familiar?
Yes.
It's like, do we ever learn from our history?
No. We keep doing it over and over.
Anyhow, I'm just glad I'm in California. Except when I'm trying to look to buy a house. Then I don't know which is better. So anyhow, so in 1913, the Native Land Act gets passed, and then little by little, more and more subsequent laws continue to get passed that continue to increase restrictions, restricting rights of non-white population. In 1948, the ruling party at that time, called the Nationalist Party, they become the dominant, dominated primarily with by the white folks, call it, passed laws that legalized segregation and formalized racial categorizing. So, 1948. So again, Desmond Tutu and his wife Leah, they're around the late 1940s, they get their teaching license. 1950s, they start teaching, and things are okay. And then in 1953, another law gets passed, and this time it's the Bantu Education Act. And what this Bantu Education Act basically does is exactly what that says. Schools are now to be segregated as well. Again, gotta keep the diseases under control, right? And so the schools that then were made what they call tribal, so that there were schools that were for the white folks, and the schools that were for the non-white folks, students. And because of that, a lot of the missionary schools, because a lot of the missionary schools were primarily for the indigenous folks, so the and the poor communities, so the non-white communities, they had a hard time gaining any support from the government. Even financial support from the government. And because of that, a lot of the missionary schools ended up having to close. They were forced to close because there was no way to operate under those conditions. And then, more and more, the non-white schools, the education, the curriculum, sounds familiar? Gets changed, controlled, and the curriculum becomes geared towards labor market. So it's not education to become a lawyer or science or doctor or whatever, right? It's primarily taught. The schools taught the non-white children basically how to work in factories.
What was the percentage of people, do you know, for like blacks compared to whites, or the indigenous? You know, I mean, was it
No, it's not 50-50. The whites were extreme minority.
the whites were a minority?
Yes, the whites were the minority. Is it 80-20? Yeah. Again, when that first law was passed, the Native Land Act, the 90% of the land was pretty much reserved for like 10% of the population. Yeah, so it was very much.
There was a large Indian community there, of course. That's where Gandhi developed.
Yes, exactly. So and again, it's not just African black population, but it was anyone that was non-white, right? So anyhow, okay. So because of that, Desmond Tutu and Leah became very discouraged, wouldn't you? And so they ended up leaving the teaching profession. And it was at that time that Trevor Huddleston, by that time he's a bishop, encouraged Desmond Tutu to consider entering the priesthood. Priesthood as in the Anglican Church priesthood, so he can stay married. And so then Desmond Tutu then, interestingly, he then was recommended by the bishop, Huddleston, to consider ordination, and he applied. And in the Anglican Church, there is an ordination class that you have to apply to. He was denied initially, even though he had the recommendation of the bishop. He was denied because he had too much debt. Again, growing up in a poor family, his education caused to become a teacher, and also just living, he had racked up some debt. And so because of that, he was denied. But somewhere along the line, his debt was actually paid off by a generous donation by a philanthropist by the name of Harry Oppenheimer. Yeah, South Africa. He donated for not just him, but various students that needed to. So he was his debt was canceled. Loan forgiveness. Here we go. It's like such a modern thing. Anyhow, so then he was he then entered St. Peter's Theological School in Johannesburg. And during his theological education, again, Desmond Tutu exhibited very strong academic abilities. The principal of the school, or the head of the school, stated, Desmond Tutu has exceptional knowledge and intelligence and is very industrious, hardworking. At the same time, he shows no arrogance, mixes in well, and is popular. He has obvious gifts for leadership. So in 1960, by 1960, he becomes ordained as an Anglican priest. He's appointed to a local church, a little church, Saint Alban, Alban the Martyr Church, which is actually primarily a white church. Right? But something about Desmond Tutu, his personality. He's, at first it was one of this and he was the very first black priest, and he was an assistant priest, associate priest at this church. But because of his personality, he won the hearts of the people, the congregation. And after serving at that church for about 2 years, the church, the congregation realized how much that Desmond Tutu was able to offer through his perspective, his life, and all of that. And the church felt that that the South African church, which was primarily white, could benefit from more black African leadership. And so they encouraged Desmond Tutu to continue his education to not just be a local pastor, local priest, but to be a teacher of priests. And so they sponsored, and through connections, they sponsored him to continue his education in London at King's College. So he ends up going from there to King's College, and he sponsored all expense paid for education. And while there, he leaving South Africa for the first time and engaging in a much broader culture, he says that Desmond Tutu said that his experience at King's College helped him to let go of the bitterness that was welling up during his time, especially leaving education and that injustice, and the feelings of racial inferiority. And it was there that he began to kind of find his voice to be able to speak out and to speak. And so while he was at King's College, he worked at St. Mary's Church Cathedral. And while there, he did a lot of St. Mary's Anglican Church. He did a lot of cooperative ministries with other denominations, Methodist and Roman Catholic. Now, he also has very close ties with the Roman Catholic Church, primarily because Leah, his wife, was Roman Catholic. In fact, his wedding was Roman Catholic, even though he was Anglican. And so he kind of finagled that one. But he did a lot of work. And so starting from his time in London, he started to really branch out and do a lot of these connectional type of ministries with other branches of the Christian faith. He also ended up, after getting his master's at King's College, goes to Jerusalem, decides to learn Greek and Arabic there. I don't know if he had to go all the way to Jerusalem to learn that, but I think it was paid for. And so might as well go to Jerusalem, right? After Jerusalem, he does return back to South Africa. And he gets hired at Federal Theological Seminary as the very first black faculty member. And at first, by this time, people are kind of testing him to see how he fits in. And in what year is this now? 19. So he went to Jerusalem in 1966. So he's there in Federal Theological Seminary, and in 1968, so a couple of years there. Oh, no, yeah. So in 1968, 67, 68, he goes to the school. So around the first or second year at that school, he gives a sermon at one of the, university chapels, right? Comparing the situation in South Africa with the, he compares it with the Eastern Bloc. Yes, and it talks about the oppression, and right after that chapel, I think that chapel was in like August in the summertime. The students respond to that and decide to have a sit-in protest. Again, criticizing the government. So, there it is. Well, this is the first time that Desmond Tutu comes under the radar of the government, right, the South African government. They start realizing, hey, who is this guy? Right, starting to speak out against the government, and more he starts doing so. In 1970, he then takes another job. He from that seminary, he takes a job with the Theological Education Fund, which actually is based in England, but the role that he had was to educate other priests or Anglican priests throughout throughout Africa, in fact, not just South Africa. And he traveled to other places all throughout Africa. And as he was traveling throughout Africa, he started witnessing in many of the colonized cities or areas the widespread corruption, the poverty, the injustice. And this begins to really cause him to find that unrest again. In 75, he becomes dean of St. Mary's Cathedral in South Africa, and then he becomes the bishop of Lesotho. Lesotho is a small little nation that's inside South Africa. So it's almost like the tribe of Benjamin within the tribe of Judah. It's its own nation. He didn't want to be bishop, but he ended up being elected. But as he becomes bishop and the dean of St. Mary's Cathedral, he starts to really find his voice. And he starts preaching more and more and speaking out more and more against the government. In 1978, Tutu becomes the general secretary of the South African Council of Churches. And so now he is even more in the spotlight. He becomes the very first black leader. He becomes the first black bishop, by the way, of South Africa. He becomes also the first black general secretary of the South African Council of Churches. And during that time, he publishes a book. So in 1980, he publishes a book, Crying in the Wilderness, that again is a collection of his sermons and speeches that really lays out the criticism of the government. He also makes a bold statement in one of his speeches that really gets the attention of the South African government, and that is that in 1980 he said that and this is one of his prophetic voice, there will be a black prime minister within 10 years. And it was a way of telling the government, if you continue to oppress these people, one day your roles will be flipped. Well, that didn't go well with the government folks. More and more, he then starts speaking out. He encourages students and folks to boycott and warn the governments of riots if they continue to, again, detain protesters and things of that sort. Throughout the 80s, he spoke out against apartheid and led non-violent marches. All of his protests were primarily non-violent, but not only non-violent. What he would say is that he's not against, or he's not a pacifist. That's what he's saying. He is not a pacifist, and yet he doesn't believe in violence. So his form of protest is that it is not about, it's very much Gandhi, yes. It's where you do not rise up arms against the establishment, yet at the same time, you don't just sit still and say nothing. That's what he meant. And so he promoted and led a lot of these marches throughout the 80s, constantly speaking out against the government, which then landed him in jail several times, and continued to do so. And the government even revoked his passport because whenever he traveled, he would find opportunities to bring, spotlight the injustices that was happening in South Africa. Because of all his work, of course, he gets to meet a lot of folks.
And did travel.
How many? Can you guys name all the folks that's on that slide? Who's that one? All right. Pope John Paul. Yeah. Carter. Oh yeah, Desmond Tutu is on the side. Obama afterward. And the Bush, yes. So, and this is just a small collection of the folk. He pretty much, again, like I said, wherever he went, he was able to draw the attention of what was going in South Africa. Because if it, and the reason why he's credited as being the voice of this prophet was because if it wasn't for Desmond Tutu, much of the world would have not either not known or turned a blind eye. Because it's not here, it's not in my backyard, it's over there. He brought it to the forefront. And that's what a prophet does. A prophet brings to the forefront the injustices that most people don't want to deal with or address, which is very common even today, right? In society, we don't want to deal with homelessness. We don't, if it's not us, then yeah. One of the things when I was at the groundbreaking, right? The reason why I was invited to that groundbreaking was because I was involved with a group in San Diego called YIGBY. You guys ever heard of YIGBY? Y-I-G-B-Y. Huh?
It almost sounds obscene.
It sounds obscene. It's an acronym. YIGBY is in response to NIMBY. Have you ever heard of NIMBY? NIMBY is that acronym, not in my backyard, right? So again, when I was in San Diego, just because the church that I served at was a downtown church, and basically we had a group that was very passionate about low-income housing, and because the last 3 churches before coming here were very much downtown churches. I dealt a lot with folks on the streets, the unhoused, and so forth. And so part of that ministry was, again, supporting homes, shelters, housing, and whatnot. And so whenever we try to go and promote, coordinate with developers and so forth to develop these low-income housing, shelters, transitional homes, there would always be pushback. Always be pushback from folks that's like, oh, I don't want a low-income housing in my neighborhood. That's going to bring our house value down. Really? There are people on the streets. Anyhow, so that's where that not in my backyard comes from. And so the churches, and a lot of our Methodist churches, unfortunately, those that are shrinking, most of the churches have these big properties and facilities with very small congregations. And so one of the things that we did a lot of was looking into redeveloping or looking at our properties as a place to build these low-income housing, shelters, and provide a place for these, what we call mission centers. And so the phrase came out, yes, in God's backyard. YIGBY versus NIMBY. Not in my backyard, so yes, in God's backyard. Because, hey, we already own the property. We don't have to get permission. And so more and more, that's the work we were doing. Again, what Desmond Tutu did was, again, bring it to the attention. to the world of what was happening in South Africa. In 1984, he received the Nobel Peace Prize for his awareness and his work and his, And then here's a little video that I want you to hear.
What, in your opinion, makes a good leader? What qualities?
Yes. It's a question that we've had to deal with quite a bit, looking at some of the leaders we have had who have sometimes led their countries into disastrous situations. I think ultimately you want a leader who is also a servant. When you look at some of the greatest leaders, Nelson Mandela is someone who is not in it for his own aggrandizement. He leads on behalf of, for the sake of. That is one. And it almost always is that the great leader will show just how he is or she is a leader for the sake of the led by suffering. That you are not one who is seeking self-glorification, who wants to feather his nest. You can look at Mother Teresa or Mahatma Gandhi, the Dalai Lama. You'll see that a great characteristic is they are doing something, sacrificial in a way for the sake of those they are serving, and suffering. Well, the Dalai Lama has been in exile for 50 years. Nelson Mandela was in jail. Mother Teresa lives with the poor. Mahatma Gandhi, you could go on. Martin Luther King. And then the leader is someone who is inspiring. That somehow the leader encapsulates and somehow represents the best that is in the people, the aspirations of the people, and yes, it is someone who can inspire.
When he received the Nobel Peace Prize, he said, when you receive the Nobel Peace Prize, you have to remember that this is not about you, that the prize belongs to the people. The people that you are, that your heart goes out to. And so, one thing that about Desmond Tutu is he is one that, even as an archbishop, one who spoke out against the government, one who traveled the world and met all kinds of folks. And there's actually on YouTube a great video of him and the Dalai Lama having these conversations, and it is hilarious. He would play jokes on the Dalai Lama.
Asked him to dance.
Exactly. Yeah. But he's one that was extremely personable. He would cry after the apartheid, and they were going through the trials and indictments of those who were part of the government. He wasn't afraid to cry as he felt for the people who were hurt by apartheid, as well as the people. One of the things that Desmond Tutu is known for was that even though he spoke out against the government, It was against the acts of the government, not the people. In fact, after receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, he continues on and he becomes the Bishop of Johannesburg and then the Archbishop of Cape Town, so all of South Africa. He continued to speak out against the violence and active in the civil disobedience against injustice. But what I'm saying is, it's not about, he's not mad at a person. He's mad about the situation and the system. And that's what he spoke out against. He encouraged the white folks, to join him in the fighting against the injustice. It wasn't about us and them. It was about changing. And so one of the things that he always talks about is the number of the white folks in Johannesburg that joined him in his movements after a while. 1990, of course, Nelson Mandela was released from prison. 94, the first democratic election, and he, as the Archbishop, was the one to, be there to, was part of the inauguration for Nelson Mandela. I said that Desmond Tutu met Nelson Mandela back when he was in college, right? They didn't speak to each other or know each other until 1990. They met once, and then it was 1990 when Nelson Mandela was in prison. That as he was speaking out against apartheid and the release of Nelson Mandela, that he reconnected with him, and then they became the best of colleagues and fight against apartheid. And then, of course, in '94, he becomes president. Continued to speak out against the government, and even after the apartheid was turned over, and then the new political party, ANC, took over. Desmond Tutu didn't stop speaking out against the government. In fact, there's times when he even said that the current government is worse than the apartheid government because at least with the apartheid government, you knew, what you were getting. What the current government, and he said this in a way of saying, if you're not living up to the promise that you made, it's worse than being clear that you're not going to do it. And so there was a time when he and Nelson Mandela actually had a falling out, such that when Nelson Mandela passed away, Nelson Mandela's family didn't invite Desmond Tutu to his funeral. But then the government asked that he be there, and so then he was there. But again, because Desmond Tutu continued to speak out, even against his own friend, keeping him accountable when he didn't do everything that he said that he would do. So,
the president of the country that followed Nelson Mandela was corrupt.
Yep.
He built a big mansion.
And he was
corrupt.
Yeah, and that's when Desmond Tutu definitely spoke out against, again, the government.
And the present president is the one that Mandela recommended follow him.
Yeah.
And he's the one that's leading South Africa now.
Yeah, it sounds like something out of the Old Testament. History repeats itself, doesn't it? Huh?
Was Tutu's wife, Leah, active with him in this process?
She was supportive. She's not in the spotlight as being like speaking out. Yeah. But his daughter, Desmond Tutu's daughter, has spoken out against the government a couple times. They have a book together, yes. Yeah. On forgiveness? Yeah. And that's how you could kind of see Desmond Tutu's, his whole theology is based upon liberation and black theology. So again, this understanding of captivity and freedom, but not in terms of just rampant freedom. Justice for the oppressed. That's what his theology is really based on. But in terms of his political views and his social justice movements, again, like I said, it's not the forgiveness. It's not about the person. It's never against the person. It's about the structure and the systems. And he coined the phrase "rainbow nation" when the apartheid ended. About this is the image of God's world. It is to be a rainbow nation, meaning all people. Is that it? I guess that's it. And it's 7:30.
I think, didn't he back what they call reconciliation? The reconciliation movement, to bring the two back.
Exactly. So it wasn't about condemning, and again, there's when Desmond Tutu passed away in 2021. I don't know if you remember seeing all these tributes of him, but many of the tributes show how even after the movement, during those trials, how he reached back and he reached out to the people of the government, the reconciliation. And so again, he was truly one who, they say that he knew how to cry, but he also knew how to laugh, and he knew how to really. There's wonderful videos of him just dancing with the Dalai Lama and with children. He loved children, and just one who had a true pastoral heart, and yet a fervor within his heart to, speak out against injustice.
What were the principles of the Reconciliation Commission?
Principles? Well, the overall idea was, if you don't forgive, then there will never be peace.
Right, and then he would.
Because no one likes to be judged.
Well, my impression was something about there was a lot of killing on both sides, the government and the people. And my understanding is the commission would say to each side, if you confess what you have done totally true, then you will be reconciled. You won't be held accountable, but you got to tell the truth. And so both sides had to tell the truth of how they were killing and each other people. Both of them had to do that.
It's like war. There's injustices that happen on both sides, you're right. It's not one or the other. And so to truly reconcile or come together, it's coming together at an open table and kind of laying it out and saying, yes, I've done wrong. And so as much as I seek your forgiveness, I forgive you.
Two things. First of all, I think it took a lot of courage for him to speak out on the LGBT issue, especially being on the African continent, where so many governments and African churches are very much opposed to it. Yeah, it's a tough issue. And also, there's a book called The Book of Joy, which when Nelson Mandela went for the Dalai Lama's birthday, they had a celebration, and this fellow that wrote the book wrote about what conversations they had. And it's
a great book.
Talk about a book of true joy. Two people who have faced tremendous hardship and yet still have joy in life. It's really...
So if you go to YouTube, Google, there's a celebration. It's about an hour video. There's a big celebration, and it starts with a bunch of children singing. So it's at a school, and there's a children's choir and a big gathering, and then Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama were in the center in the chair, and well, a good chunk of it you can't really understand because the Dalai Lama is speaking Tibetan, but halfway through he does start speaking English. But the jokes that go back and forth between the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu is hilarious.
What's the name of that book?
What's it called?
The Book of Joy.
But the Book of Joy was the book, but what I'm talking about is YouTube. It's called YouTube.
As they moved forward, and the initial concept was, I'll tell you my bad, you tell your bad, nobody's responsible then?
I don't think there's nobody's
You accept your responsibility, and that allows for forgiveness.
Yeah, it's not that you're not responsible, but by admitting your what you have done. So basically, in many ways, we talk about part of reconciliation is for all parties to admit that we have all been participants to the injustice, or we have been participants to the system that have perpetuated the
And so now, how far along in that process would you assess they are?
It hasn't gone.
in South Africa.
Yeah, it hasn't gone.
About the same as Florida.
It hasn't gone. I think that you have to. He was in a political situation, so the goal has to be. If we just punish people, what's that going to create? That will just create
Clear example.
Israelis, Palestinians.
Yes, exactly.
If we can't get beyond that, so you got to get beyond just punishment. You accept responsibility, but you forgive. But you also say we had something
to do with that
because there were black atrocities. It wasn't just the whites. They may have set up the system.
In all situations, it's very much like that. Even with the after World War I, what happened? And then of course that. So in many ways, the nations that won in what was that group called? In World War I, it's not the Allies. That's World War II, isn't it? There was something. Anyhow, the ones that won, right? By punishing Germany, the ones that won have to take responsibilities that they created Germany that started World War II.
I don't think World War I ever stopped.
Well,
I mean, it paused.
basically it is. It was the cause and effect. It was the cause for World War II. So, but in all situations, that's what it is. And Israel and Palestine situation is that. And in many ways, even the war now and in all situations, we have to realize that in any context of conflict, it's always both sides. It's never one, right? So, anyhow, well, thank you for joining me. And next week, we will be looking at C.S. Lewis, and then
the following week will be the Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh, Vietnamese Buddhists, and the week after that it will be two Hindus, Rabindranath Tagore, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, first non-Westerner doing that, and another man by the name of Aurobindo Ghosh, who was a famous mystic. Started off as a terrorist.
Wow.
Became one of India's most famous mystical teachers.
Well, again, thank you, and we will adjourn for tonight.